Okay, our Torah portion is Vayigash, and it's a continuation, really, of last week's Torah portion. And I'm going to bring some of the same elements from last week over into this week. And one thing I wanted to do is kind of have a little bit of a part 3 because I felt we left a few threads hanging. What else that we saw with, primarily with the flight of Yaakov and his family from Levine, from that particular exile. However, there's some interesting parallels in some of the narratives of Elisha after he succeeds Eliyahu. And there's also some interesting parallels, I think, with Zerubbabel and Yahweh in terms of returning from Babylon to build the second temple. And so we will continue with that because there are parallels there that I think Yosef was kind of the prototype to help us understand what's going on there. And we'll do that with tomorrow's class. But with this class, I thought we would do something that grew out of last week. And I don't remember if it was this class or if it was the Tuesday class. One of you in the after class discussion asked, why didn't Joseph send word to his father that he was okay? Why in 22 years would he not let his father know that, everything was all right? We can understand him being in prison and not sending word, or being in a state of slavery and not sending word. But at this point, when the brothers appear in his life, he's had 7 good years and the famine has started. I mean, he's had enough time to get married and have 2 children. So there has been plenty of time, to drop a postcard off to Abba and say, hey, Dad, everything's great. The sun is good. Everything's fine. And he just doesn't. So I thought, well, that's a great question. And sometimes great questions are great motivators to say, well, let's follow up on that question. Let's see if we can find an answer to that question. Of course, we have no way of knowing whether it's the right answer. But I thought that the question was so excellent, we deserve to take a stab at it. So that's what I did. Did a little bit of investigating. I basically exhausted my resources in terms of books I had on the shelf. I'm always hesitant to do a lot of research on the internet unless it's into a primary source, because that's truly not real research unless it is a primary source. So basically I combed through a lot of rabbinic commentary to see if it shed any light on the portion. I spent a lot of time sitting at the doctor's office today, and I took this with me and I combed through it in Hebrew, English, and finally I found a commentary by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was, I don't know if he still is, but he was the chief rabbi of Great Britain. And he has very good common sense commentaries, and sometimes I see them, they're like little miniature articles on the Torah portion. In Israel News, I can't remember the website, but it's one of the Israel National News websites. And I always enjoyed reading the little commentaries, and so I found a couple of used books, and so I went through. Fortunately, one of them was Bereshit. And in combing through that today, I think I may have found a good answer. I don't know if it's the answer, but I think it's a good answer because it takes us step by step, and it's actually a great way of summarizing the story of Yosef, especially since we're going to see him basically as prototypical of Messiah in many ways. or roles, not just of Messiah, but of several roles within the tribes of Israel. And no, you get in your chair. So let me just go ahead and pull up the, here it is. So I went ahead and entitled it, Does My Father Live? Because I think that encapsulates maybe our answer to this great question. Play from start. And we will, by the way, end up in Ezekiel one way or the other tomorrow, because the passage that I had picked out to focus on had to do with the shepherds of Israel, especially bringing in, the teaching on the seven shepherds and the eighth prince at the Hanukkah conference this last weekend. But there's also, not just in Amos or Micha, but in Ezekiel, there's quite a bit of information on the shepherds of Israel. So we will end up back there tomorrow in Ezekiel, if you want to take a gander through the Haftorah portion. Okay, so here's our good question. Why didn't Joseph send word to his father that he was safe? Now, we can understand he didn't necessarily want to contact his brothers, but it doesn't make sense that he wouldn't want to contact his father. And like I said, it's impossible for us to know for sure because we're not inside the heads of any of these people. All we know is what the dialogue tells us and what the narrator tells us, which the narrator presumably is going to be Moses. And so we have to kind of take our clues from context, from dialogue. And what we want to do is we want to go back to the dreams, because I think they have a bearing on the answer to the question. In fact, I think it's actually the heart of the question. So here's, if you remember, this is the first one, and there's a slight difference in the two, even though they're the same dream. And just like Pharaoh's dream, Yosef said, these are the same dream that you're dreaming. They're a bit different in terms of audience. So in the first one, in Genesis 37:7, he says, behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered round and bowed down to my sheaf. And the key here is he told it to his brothers. That's the context of this dream. He told it to his brothers. So his brothers really don't have any, misconceptions about who the sheaves in the dream are, because Yosef is interpreting as he tells the dream. And so he's telling it to a specific audience and he's interpreting as he goes. So we cannot mistake this dream for any other audience. It's specifically his 11 brothers. They are the sheaves. His sheaf is going to stand up, and then their sheaves gather to him and bow down. All right, of course, they're going to see this as a dream of dominance, not necessarily togetherness, nor are they going to see it necessarily as a messianic prophecy, as Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah, the son of Joseph. Then there's another dream. And this one is of the sun, the moon, and 11 stars. And I think this might be our first clue where something goes wrong if we're going to answer the question, why didn't Yosef send word to his father? Yes, we understand, not the brothers, but why not Yaakov? And in this one, he says, lo, I've had still another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Now, there's a slight difference here. It says he related this dream to his father and to his brothers. So when you see the order like that, typically it's going to tell you that the first person in the order is going to be the primary audience, and then whoever comes second would be secondary. So this dream is directed primarily to his father. And of course, the brothers are around. I mean, he eventually tells the brothers. Does he tell them at the same time? We don't exactly know. But he does get around to telling them. But first of all, we know this dream is aimed straight at Yaakov. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bound to Yosef. And he's interpreting again as he goes. So his father really doesn't have any trouble grasping the implication of either the dream or how Yosef is telling it. All right, so I'm having to move some things around on the screen because I can't see them on full screen. All right, so let's think about some other events. Remember we said last week, the brother that Yosef kept in prison is significant because remember we looked at the 7 abominations of the wicked land. And we saw the most extreme violation, the most extreme abomination is to separate brothers, which is exactly what the brothers did to Yosef. And so in turn, in doing things to nudge their memories, to cause them to make associations to the situation with him, he separates his brother Shimon. And we suggested that maybe demanding that they return with the youngest brother, yes, that's important, but part of that is at the exact same time, he's telling them, you're going to have to bring me this younger brother. He's also imprisoning Shimon to see if they will return for him. It's a kind of a two-pronged test there, not just including Benjamin, that's important, but I think we overlook the importance of who he picked and what he might have hoped to gain by keeping Shimon. Would they turn back to come and retrieve him? Or would they just leave him out there and never seek him? And apparently the answer is they're never going to seek Shimon either. And ironically, Shimon is like Levi. His allotment within the tribes of Israel, he was basically swallowed up like Levi was kind of dispersed among the tribes because of the priesthood and because of the Levitical service. Shimon likewise is kind of just going to get swallowed up, mainly within the tribe of Judah, because his tribal territory again is in the extreme south, down in the Arava, and that's also the tribal territory of Yehuda. And at some point, Shimon really loses his identity in Yehuda and gets swallowed up there, even though, according to Ezekiel, when the tribes are brought back to the land, instead of it looking, and somebody sent me a great graphic a couple of years ago, and I'll have to look to see if I can find it again. But instead of the territorial allotments going by lot, like, selecting lots and seeing how some territories are bigger than others and they're kind of in odd shapes and so forth. And Ezekiel, in the millennial reign, or we would say at the time of the third temple, the tribes basically just have kind of, it looks like striations, like they're just stacked up there fairly or equally. It's obviously, I don't want to say more of an artificial, but definitely more of a straight line allotment. And I guess at that time, Shimon's territory would be much easier to spot than it was in the time of the judges or the kings. But Yosef sees in this, what's their behavior going to be? And really, they're not concerned. Nobody ever really mentions Shimon. It's the whole conversation centers on Benjamin. And Yosef can kind of see, well, buddy, you're in the same situation I was. Once they get rid of you, they're not going to come back and try to find you. But it's when they get to that point that they're out of grain, when they run out of bread, that's when they consider going back to Egypt. Shimon is no pressing issue to them, but Shimon has a history with his father, and he has a history with his sister. He, remember, was one of the two brothers who was willing to go to Shechem. Remember, they took counsel with Yaakov. The brothers sat around and they took counsel with their dad when the issue of Shechem came up, because Shechem offers to, do whatever is necessary to have Dinah as his wife. He agrees to be circumcised. It's basically the story of the Jerusalem Council all over again. And I don't remember, there's a teaching back there I've done on that. But it's just right down the line. Everything is parallel down to the names. Like James, his Hebrew name would be Yaakov. The question is, are these Gentiles sincere? How will we know these Gentiles are sincere? The ones who want them circumcised, how sincere are they? Are they just wanting to control and take revenge? Or are they truly welcoming these repentant Gentiles as brothers within the family? So that's a great proto-prophecy right there. However, Shimon was committed enough to his sister basically to violate the will of his father and to go and to retrieve Dinah. Because remember, even though Shechem wanted to marry her, and he seems to be very honest and sincere in his repentance, he doesn't release Dinah back to her family. He still has her while he's negotiating the price. And remember, she was raped. She basically lost her garment to Shechem. And it's no coinkydink that Yosef goes to seek his brothers at Shechem. There's a history already there with the brothers, not a pleasant one. Yaakov was not pleased that they appeared. They gave the appearance of having one plan, but they were deceptive, and then they killed a bunch of people. And we understand why Yaakov is upset, but we can see that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, because Yaakov also is known for making plans, devising plans, but keeping his mouth shut while he executes them. So the boys obviously come by the skill honestly, but it's in this place that there's already a lot of history, and it's in this place where there is a field that Yaakov has bought, where there is a well. And hopefully in tomorrow's class, we can look at the passage of the Samaritan woman at the well and see if we can find some more parallels there in the conversation and some of the things that Yeshua does and says to the Samaritan woman. But it's probably in this particular field that Yaakov bought that the brothers are supposed to be pasturing the sheep. And maybe this is why Yaakov is concerned. Maybe that's why he feels like Yosef needs to go check up on them, because when they left that place, it wasn't under, with a great reputation. The surrounding cities, and remember back then you have kind of like city states. People don't just, have farms out in the country. They live in the city and then they go out into the countryside to do their farming and vineyards and those sorts of things, to pasture their livestock. But the safety is in the city. So basically they've wiped out the males who are of warrior age. We'll look at that specific passage so you can see where we're getting that. So there would have still been a remnant of the Shechemites, even though they, the women and children, you would have still had possibly surrounding settlements where they would have known the story of Shechem, because that's what Yaakov says. You've made me odious in the land, like everybody's going to hear about this. You've destroyed my reputation. And so sending the brothers right back to that area to pasture the sheep could have been risky. There could have been people who would wanted to have taken revenge. It's a strange selection of location. So Genesis 37:12 says, then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, and notice in this case, he's not called Jacob, he's called Israel, which gives it a really wide prophetic implication. Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them. And he said to him, I will go. Then he said to him, go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock. And that's a key word or phrase, the welfare of the flock. He doesn't want to just know how the brothers are doing. He wants to know how the flock is doing. And again, that's going to tie into some things in Ezekiel, where it speaks about the shepherds of Israel, who are not tending to the welfare of the flock. He says, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now, last year on this Torah portion, we talked about the difference between the valley of Hebron and the normal way that you would look at Hebron. It's not in a valley. Now, there's valleys running, obviously, north and south, because you got the path of the patriarchs there. But where he would have sent Joseph shouldn't have been a valley unless there's a more prophetic hint to using that. And of course, a valley implies death. It can imply a danger of death. And so he's not sending him from a good place in Hebron. He's not sending him from a good spiritual place in Hebron. So let's see if we can spot all the problems with this mission. And it might explain to us why Joseph did not notify Yaakov that he was okay. So here's what we know. We have to conduct an investigation. We know that both Yaakov and Joseph know that the 10 brothers were previously offended. Where Benjamin was on this, we know he was basically just a boy, very young. So he's not going to be old enough to take offense yet. So the 10 brothers, they were offended. And it doesn't start with the dream. It starts before this. Because Joseph, it says he was a shepherd when he was 17. And he started tattling when they would mistreat the flocks. And you can see back here, this is Yaakov's question. See about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock. He's concerned about the flock, that maybe they're mistreating it. So Joseph has tattled on this mistreatment previously, because it says Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. So they weren't doing a good job. And there's 4 of these. There's 4 sons of the concubines. And so Joseph brings back a bad report about them. So he already was not on the good side of at least 4 of his brothers. Now, we have to go back, and both Yaakov and Joseph are going to be aware of this. The boys know the story because they know of the terror, basically, that Yaakov had when he knew that Esau was approaching with 400 men. So they know the story of how Yaakov deceived Isaac into giving him the blessing. They know how he sold a pot of lentils, of red stuff, to Esau in exchange for the birthright. And they also know that Yaakov had to come to Aram because Esau had resolved to kill him. As soon as his parents died, he said, I'll wait until then, I'll honor my parents, but as soon as they're gone, I'm going to kill Yaakov. Now, this is serious when it comes to sibling rivalry. All right, this isn't normal sibling rivalry. This is murderous sibling rivalry. And as far as that goes, he probably knows the history of the world to that point. And he knows that the first murder was between siblings. So both of them very much know the danger between brothers when there is offense. So in spite of knowing how profound Yaakov's terror of Esau was, in spite of knowing the history of the world, the first murder, in spite of all that, Yaakov decides to send a minor son, a son that's not even old enough to go out to war yet. And he sends him alone to Shechem, to a place that already has a history where people don't like Yaakov's family, where there's an offense resting there against Yaakov's family. And he sends a minor boy on this journey of around 100 kilometers. So, and remember, in ancient times, a journey was considered to be a life-threatening endeavor. There were so many dangers on the road, not just of bandits, but of disease, of, sandstorms, flash floods, you name it. There was all sorts of things that could happen to you on a long journey. So when you went on a long journey, it's almost like you were dead until there were reports that you were alive. And we can kind of see this if you think of the Passover Sheni, if you've been defiled by a corpse, or if you've been on a long journey and you missed the Passover, it's kind of two ways of saying the same thing, ironically. And they say, okay, if you missed it here, then a month later, then you can make it up. You can have the Passover. If you're unclean from a corpse or you've been on a long journey. Well, because of the danger of the journey in ancient times, it was as if you were dead until you showed up. So, okay, Yosef is not going around the world in 80 days, but still 100 kilometers to a 17-year-old boy alone in a bad neighborhood, because remember, right there in the neighborhood of Hebron, it has strange neighbors. And that's why we said, man, that's just amazing that Abraham could get along in that neighborhood, because you have Canaanites, you have Amorites, you have Perizzites, you have giants, you have the Anakim, you have the Rephaim. And then as he gets closer to Shechem, he is going to be passing through possibly these little self-contained city-states who have heard the story of the Shechemites and the sons of Yaakov, and we can't imagine that they would be that friendly. Now, they might be terrified too to do anything to Yosef, but again, if you catch somebody out alone, then it's real easy to murder him. And we don't know if this is why, but there's a rabbinic tradition that, of course, this is pre-Torah at Sinai. So this is tradition, we have to put it in that box. But the rabbis say that the last tenet of the Torah that Yaakov and Yosef studied before he left was of the person who's murdered between territories, and it can't be determined who killed the person or how the person died. And so they figure out, they measure what the closest city is, and then they have to basically break the neck of a cow and offer that sacrifice there. And that's how Yaakov knew that Yosef was alive, because he sent the wagons drawn by the cows, the ox carts. And because only those two would have known, that's what they talked about before he left. That was a sign to Yaakov. We don't know if that's true or not, but we can recognize that this journey was dangerous. And yet, Yaakov sends him anyway. Now, this is the son that he loves the most. if he favors this son, he's made in this wonderful coat to show all the other brothers how wonderful Yosef is and how highly favored he is and how he gets to stay at home with daddy while they're out tending sheep. Well, then this is an odd move. This doesn't add up. If you were a detective, if you were an investigator, and you were marking this information down in your notebook, you would already be frowning because this doesn't add up. What else do we know? Well, there again, when you're looking for probable cause, when a crime is committed, if you know the emotional state of the two parties before they parted ways, or at least one of the parties said they parted ways, we know that Yaakov may have been angry with Yosef. And that might get us kind of to the heart of why wouldn't Yosef try to contact his father? It may have been Yaakov's state of mind, at least as it concerned Yosef, before Yosef left. Because this is what precedes, in using these verses in order, this is what precedes Yosef's departure to Shechem, this strange journey that it doesn't sound like any normal father would send a son on, at least not a 17-year-old son. And it goes back to the dream of the sun, the moon, and the stars. It says, Yosef related the dream to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, this dream that you have had, shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come and bow ourselves down before you to the ground? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. And apparently these are two different ways of looking at the effect the dream had. The brothers, yes, were jealous, but they already were jealous. That's not news. What is news is at this point, Yaakov keeps this saying in mind. He doesn't let it go. He doesn't write it off as the ramblings of a 17-year-old. It says Yaakov kept this particular interpretation in mind. And we know he was angry because of the rebuke. He didn't forget it. And the rabbi said, well, why was it so offensive to Yaakov? Other than the disrespect, there's an obvious disrespect within the dream if you only interpret it on one level as a power play or a dominion issue. We know that it was much more than that, that he's dreaming of exile, and this dream is connected to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob before him. But they're looking at this with a very narrow viewpoint. And however Yaakov is seeing it, he rebukes Joseph because of it, and he doesn't forget it. And possibly, and see, he brings Joseph's mother, and possibly even Leah. We assume he's talking about Joseph's mother. He says, your mother. I'm sure he was still grieving over his wife, still realizing that it's partly his fault that Rachel died, because he said, whoever has these teraphim will die. And of course, his beloved Rachel dies. And that's what he says later to Joseph. He says, she died on my account. He admits it. He admits the act, which was an angry outburst that actually brought about her eventual demise. Now, in this case, how that Yaakov is angry, and he does say something. Now, he doesn't say you're going to die or anything that extreme, but we get the idea that he is really unhappy with Yosef because of this dream. And possibly even he thought it referred to Leah as his mother. At any rate, he doesn't like it because he rebukes him. So let's look at it from Joseph's point of view. He's a 17-year-old boy. And how many of us have misread people when we were 17 years old? It's possible to be precocious and have a lot of information as a child, but you don't know people. You don't, because you don't have the experience with people and situations. So from the viewpoint of a 17-year-old boy, he knows he's made his father angry with his dream. He knows his father hasn't forgotten the dream, and therefore maybe he's still angry about the dream. He knows his father knows how much his brothers hate him. That's not news either. He knows his father knows that brothers can plot murder against one another. He knows his father knows this journey is dangerous. Yosef knows all these things at age 17. What he may not, know ultimately are all the little pieces that are going to drop into place that would prevent him from putting together the right read on the situation. But he knows something else about his father. His father is a passive aggressive. That's how he works. He's smart. He would 10 times rather outsmart you than outfight you, although there's evidence that he could do that because he talks about taking this property from the Amorites with his sword and with his bow. But we have much more evidence that when you get on Yaakov's bad side, he gets you back sneakily. When he wants something, it's not typically face-to-face. And when it is face-to-face, he can make an angry outburst, but he would much rather do things quietly and pull the strings from behind the scenes. And this wasn't cured. This passive aggression was not cured. It's still part of Yaakov's nature. And Yosef knows it. He knows his father, just like we know our own parents. Most of us knew our own parents better than they knew themselves, just like our parents knew us better than we knew ourselves. And that's kind of an irony. But he knows his father still has these tendencies because, if you noticed, when the issue came up with Dinah and Shechem, Yaakov takes no leadership in this. Whatever he's planning on the surface, it looks like nothing's going on. All right, same thing with his issue with Lavan. He gets 3 days head start running away before Lavan figures out he's gone. He waits till he knows Lavan is sheep shearing. And sheep shearing is not just practical, it was also a time when there was a debauchery and people were liable to be getting drunk. It was like the threshing floor. The sheep shearing and the threshing floor were times that people tended to do a lot of partying and heavy drinking. And they figured, well, even if Lavan hears of it, maybe he'll be, basically so drunk. It'll be a lot more difficult for him to chase after us. We see this with Yehuda. He goes down to the sheep shearing and he seeks out a prostitute. So at times, too much stuff going on here. So he knows that his father is sending him to a specific location. And it would have to cross Yosef's mind, knowing what he knows about what happened at Shechem. Why would my dad send me to Shechem? It has this history of hatred, of rape, of violence. And even Yaakov has said how horrible this is going to be in terms of his reputation. Nevertheless, Yaakov is sending him probably to the very place in the entire land of Israel that's going to be dangerous in that respect. That, at least for Yosef in his young life, he has this history, this memory of history that's going to be filled with hatred and violence and deceit. Because remember, when Shimon and Levi answered Shechem in terms of giving Dinah to him as a wife. It says Yaakov's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with deceit. With deceit, that's clear. So what would Joseph expect his brothers' behavior to be in this particular location? Well, they have no problem speaking deceitfully when someone gets on their bad side. Yaakov never had any trouble speaking with someone deceitfully. It backfired on him with Lavan because, Lavan gave it to him just as, harshly as Yaakov was capable of dishing it out. But here's the history. Dinah was raped and kidnapped there. And his brothers Shimon and Levi killed the men of Shechem. It says very specifically in 34:30, all who went out the gate. So who was circumcised? Basically the men of war, because those who could go out and come in were basically, it's a reference to war. So all the men of war age have been circumcised. And on the third day, and remember Yosef puts them into prison for 3 days, but when they're in the pain of circumcision on the third day, then Shimon and Levi go in there. They kill all the men of war. They take the women, they take the children, they take the loot. And this is how they get on Yaakov's bad side. But nevertheless, they spoke with deceit while they set up a plan. And it was a violent plan. It was a murderous plan, and that's where it was executed. So you can see in his mind, it's not like going to Disneyland. This is, not going to be a great vacation. Plus, what else does Yosef know in hindsight? Well, remember what we know about the Ishmaelites and the Midianites. They were traitors. And the Ishmaelites had close family ties to the Egyptians. The Midianites likewise were traitors. They were buddy-buddy with the Edomites especially, not just the Ishmaelites. And again, the Edomites are going to be family relatives to the Egyptians. So are the Hebrews, all right? We're talking about cousins here. We're talking about a big family thing where everybody knows about everybody else. And here's what the brothers had to have known when they sold Yosef, when they allowed the Ishmaelites / Midianites to carry Yosef into Egypt. They had to have known what Yosef was in for. It wasn't just forced servitude. It was much more serious than that. Because we know that later, as Moses is delineating the sexual sins that the Israelites are supposed to avoid, he points out the Egyptians as an example. He's like, basically, he says, don't practice according to the acts of the Egyptians. Why? Because the Egyptians practice all sorts of deviant sexual behavior. They practice homosexuality, they practice pedophilia, and if they had either male or female slaves, they would be sexually abused. And so by turning Yosef over to these Ishmaelite traders that they knew were headed toward Egypt, they knew where they had come from and they knew where they were headed. So they knew that Yosef, being so young and so handsome, it was practically guaranteed that he would suffer sexual abuse, not just slavery, especially because he was young and handsome. He was going to be, highly desired. And so the rabbis look into this situation and they're reading some things into the text. We know that after everything is okay, Yosef is promoted by Pharaoh and he's given Asenat as a wife. she is described as the daughter of Potipharah, which is a feminine version of Potiphar. And that's either one of the strangest coincidences in the Bible, or there's something going on here. And what they tell us is that when Potiphar found out his wife's claim that Joseph had tried to seduce her, it didn't just make him angry that Joseph might have tried to seduce his wife. It made him angry that he would possibly prefer Potiphar's wife to Potiphar, because Potiphar also had designs on Joseph. And as punishment for his lust and for the injustice of throwing Joseph into prison, they tell us that Potiphar was stricken supernaturally in his male organs, and he became like a woman, and he had to take on the name Potipharah, which is that feminized version. And then his daughter, from his, we would say his normal marriage, was given to Joseph as a wife. And they say the reason that Potiphar's wife went after Joseph is, you know, the Egyptians did practice magic and sorcery, and that she actually, through some oracle of some kind, got the message that Joseph was going to, you know, be part of the family. And her interpretation of this was that, oh, you know, I'll have a child by Joseph, when actually it was her daughter that was going to have a child or two children with Joseph. And possibly he had more. That just, we know that Yaakov says, Ephraim and Menashe are going to be mine. Any others that you have will be yours. But again, we have this near rape of Joseph. Definitely sexual abuse. And it's suspiciously similar to what happens in Shechem, where you see Shimon and Levi taking basically a sexual vengeance on the Shechemites, demanding that they become circumcised, and then while they're in that pain, going in there and taking revenge for the rape of Dinah. So there's also sexual undertones to this. So in hindsight, right, in foresight, Joseph doesn't know all these things are going to happen. In hindsight, he looks back and he says, no, wait a minute. If Dad set this up with my brothers, and he intended for me to be sold to the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, and he knew that I would be sold into Egypt, and he knew that I would be desirable as more than a slave, but also as a sexual slave, then you can see why in his young mind he would have wondered exactly what Dad and my brothers were up to. Were the dreams so bad that they would put this together? Here's what Yaakov said in Genesis 34:25. It says, it came about on the third day, when they were in pain, that two of Yaakov's sons, Shimon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came upon the city unawares and killed every male. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went forth. Yaakov's sons came upon the slain and looted the city, because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds and their donkeys, and that which was in the city and that which was in the field. And they captured and looted all their wealth and all their little ones and their wives, even all that was in the house. Then Yaakov said to Shimon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me. Okay, the root of this is tzur, where we get tribulation in English. Basically saying, you brought Jacob's trouble on me by making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and my men being few in number, they will gather together against me and attack me, and I will be destroyed, I and my household. So he's not happy at this point with Shimon and Levi. Yosef knows this too, that Yaakov became very angry with Shimon and Levi. It's kind of like with King David. He's more upset with the problem between Absalom and Amnon and that murder. It's like he completely ignores what was done to Tamar. It's almost like a replay of this with Yaakov. He's worried about Dinah's honor than about just sitting and contemplating the problem and remaining silent. And so it's Shimon and Levi that step up. But then once they step up and fill that vacuum of leadership, and the rabbis point out it's a lack of communication. He's just not talking. Sometimes when Yaakov should be talking, he's not. And then sometimes when he's talking, he's saying the exact wrong thing. He has a little angry streak. Just like he burst out at Rachel when she says, give me children or I die. He says, am I in the place of God? And they say, that was wrong. You don't make fun of someone who is in that distress of the soul with that kind of answer. And so he does have these angry outbursts. And sometimes, we only hold up the great parts of the patriarchs and we don't consider what life would have been on the ground, from day to day. In hindsight, it's all glory, but from day to day, the view would have been a lot different. And so there's a little bit of estrangement there between Shimon and Levi and Yaakov. And then there was another son that came under Yaakov's wrath. In Genesis 35:22, it says, it came about while Israel was dwelling in that land that Reuven went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Now, we just take that at face value and believe that there was actually a sexual act. There are some traditions that say what Reuven did is he only moved Yaakov's bed from Bilhah's tent to Leah's. When Rachel died, Yaakov and Rachel had tented together because she was the primary wife. And when Rachel died, rather than moving his bed into Leah's tent, he moved into Rachel's handmaid's tent, into one of the concubines' tent. And Reuven felt that disrespect to his mother, and he went and took the bed and moved it into Leah's tent. But Yaakov thought he slept with her. We don't know what happened. I kind of take that at face value that something happened, but it's possible he believes something happened when actually he moved the bed. In any case, it was an act of extreme disrespect. So in this case, we don't hear Israel say anything about it at that time. We're told that he heard of it, but we don't see that he said anything to Reuven about it until much, much, much later. And they say all through this narrative, the story of Yosef, they say is the longest narrative in the Torah in terms of an individual. But this lack of communication is taking a toll on the family. Just like, Rachel apparently didn't tell Yaakov, she took Lavan's teraphim. Lack of communication. People not saying the things that they should say or saying things that they shouldn't say. And they say, if you really want a lesson in Musar and Lashon Hara and, proper use of the tongue, the story of this family is the proof text. At any rate, we see that this passive-aggressive tendency of Yaakov to get angry with you now, but really let you know it later, is when he blesses his sons in Genesis 49, 4-7. And if you'll notice, in birth order, you've got Reuven, you've got Shimon, you've got Levi, and then Yehuda. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we know that Reuven is going to have the birthright, but maybe not. It says, Reuven, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Well, that sounded great up until that point. But then apparently Yaakov remembers. Uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Bam. That's throughout Reuven as the one that's going to have the birthright. Then it comes to the second two, Shimon and Levi. He says, Shimon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are implements of violence. Let my soul not enter into their counsel. Let not my glory be united with their assembly, because in their anger they slew men. Okay, apparently they can anger honestly. And in their self-will, they lamed oxen. It's interesting, too, that Yosef is called an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will disperse them in Yaakov and them in Israel, and he did, in terms of inheritance. So right there, he shunts Shimon Levi in terms of taking on the preeminence of the firstborn. Reuven out, Shimon out, Levi out. And that brings us to Yehuda, who was the fourth. And of course, if we keep reading in that passage, we realize that that crown has fallen on Yehuda, and then a separate sort of blessing was given to Yosef that is like a crown, but it made him separate. Even among his brothers, it made him separate as a Nazir, as a consecrated one. So we see that the boys continued to live with their father, but Yaakov never forgot their disrespect. He was big on respect issues. And I can imagine that Yosef, young Yosef, would have known these things as he's making that trip to Shechem. Knows how unforgetful his father can be when he feels as though he's been disrespected or been slighted. He knows that he's just been rebuked for his dream. And there's no reason that the rest of the family couldn't see that strain between Yaakov and the three eldest brothers. Yosef knows he's added to the strain. So in addition to the three eldest brothers being on Yaakov's bad side, he's also put Dan, Gad, Naphtali, and Asher on Dad's bad side because he brought the evil reports about their shepherding. And apparently the reports were so bad that his father sent him to follow up, which kind of, when they eventually go down to Egypt, the first thing Yosef does, he accuses them of spying. They appear in Egypt, thinking, surely this is going to remind them of Yosef, because that's exactly what I did to them. I went down basically to spy on them for my dad. Surely they'll think of me or mention me when I accuse them of spying. So if you assemble all these incidents and make them just as human as they are, try not to spiritualize them. Just make them as human as they are. It's possible that Yosef believed his father was so provoked about this respect dream that he sent Yosef on a dangerous journey on purpose, knowing his brothers would want to do away with him. And that's what the text tells us. It says that Yosef, he was blundering, he was erring in the field of Shechem. And Yosef, in hindsight, has no way of knowing what his father's actual thoughts were in sending him on this journey. He has no way of knowing his father's actual reaction when he finds out that Yosef has disappeared and he sees the torn garment and the blood on the garment. He has no, we know these things because the narrator is telling us as we go. We're on the outside looking in and we know every thought and move. Yosef doesn't know every thought and move once he's put in chains. So you know what we do. When we don't know facts, we fill them in. And this is the speculation. And it comes from Genesis 41:50. It says, now, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Yosef, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. Yosef named the firstborn Menashe, for he said, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. He mentions that very specifically. You would think, well, if it's just his brothers that were mean to him, he would say, forget all my troubles and all my brothers. But he doesn't say that. He says, my father's household. Even when his firstborn son is born, Joseph doesn't know that his brothers have deceived his father with that special tunic. And so he doesn't know why dad never came looking for him in Egypt. Yaakov had enough money, he could have repurchased him from slavery. For all he knows, his dad planned it. But, and this is a great place, I guess, to stop. At the end of this Torah portion in Vayigash, Yehuda approaches Yosef on behalf of Benjamin. And it's only at this point, because like he keeps going through this charade and see if the dream really was about, I want my brothers to bow down to me, then he doesn't have to take it this far. Because he gets that on the first visit. He could have said, nah, 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 nah. I told you you'd have to bow down. He doesn't do that. He keeps playing this charade until he can't play it anymore. Genesis 41:27 says, your servant, my father, this is Yehuda talking to Yosef. He says, your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons, and the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn in pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one also from me, and harm befalls him, you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. Now therefore, when I come to your servant, my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, when he sees that the lad is not with us, he will die. Thus, your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in sorrow. It's only at this point where Joseph is allowed to get into the mind of his father. Up until then, he can't tell from what they are saying whether his father was in on it or not. But finally, when Yehuda draws near and approaches, and he starts telling the story, he says that one phrase, surely he is torn in pieces. This was Yaakov's reaction. And he sees that his reaction was sorrow. He really is grieving over Yosef. He really was deceived as to what happened to Yosef. So no, Dad wasn't in on it. Daddy really loves me. Daddy didn't set me up. You know, he didn't pay me off like he did Reuven, or like Shimon, and like Levi. He didn't send me to Shechem to be torn in pieces by wild beasts, my brothers. He didn't send me into Egypt to be a slave or a sex slave. Daddy really didn't know. And Daddy loves me. And in the end, isn't that all we want to know, is that our parents love us? And in the end, all we really want to know is, Doesn't my Father in heaven love me? Doesn't he miss me in the garden? And I think that is as good an explanation as I've ever heard as to why Joseph never sought out his father once he could. And I would say we are not unlike Joseph. Because when we're young and we don't have the experience of the world, and there's circumstantial events out there that makes us wonder whether somebody really does love us, rather than be hurt again, we just let the relationship go dormant. And sometimes it's worth it to find out the truth, if you can. What was in your mind, Dad? When you sent me, a 17-year-old boy, to Shechem alone to go spy on my brothers, what was in your head? And that would give Yaakov the opportunity, or Daddy the opportunity, to say, you know what? I don't know what was in my head that day. I must have been insane. I lost my mind that day. I was distracted. It never dawned on me. Sometimes we have to give people the opportunity to just say they fell down on the job.